Good afternoon to all of you. 안녕하세요, 여러분. Welcome to the 7th Philippine Korean Studies Symposium. I am Kay Sirico from the Korean Studies program of the Ateneo de Manila University and the UP Department of Linguistics, and I will be your moderator for today's session. We are delighted to welcome our participants who are joining us in the safety of their homes through UPKRC's YouTube channel. Before we begin our program, we would like to remind our audience on some house rules. You may send questions and comments throughout the presentations and discussions in our YouTube chat room. The questions will then be collected and answered by our speaker during the open forum. We're also reminded that the whole symposium is a safe space and thus will not tolerate any form of bullying and trolling, academic or otherwise. The organizing committee reserves the right to remove those who will create any disruption in any part of the program. At this point, please allow me to provide a brief background about the organizers of today's program. The UP Korea Research Center was launched in April 2016 to provide Filipino scholars and researchers with opportunities to widen their interest in Korean studies. The center conducts various academic and cultural activities for scholars and professionals and serves as a university-wide hub that promotes and develops Korean studies in the Philippines. For more information and updates on the UP Korea Research Center, you may visit their Facebook page www.facebook.com/UPKRC. The UP Department of Linguistics, established on the 28th of August 1922, has been at the forefront of language studies in the Philippines, primarily in the scientific study, preservation, and promotion of Philippine languages and dialects through teaching, research, and publication. It also aims to contribute to general and theoretical linguistics and use research to significantly help in addressing language issues in the country. Housed in the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, the Department of Linguistics is the only institution in the country that offers BA, MA, and PhD degrees in linguistics. It is designated by CHED as a Center of Excellence in Foreign Languages for its contributions to the improvement of teaching of the national languages of Asia. It offers a roster of Asian languages which are integrated in the BA Linguistics course plans. We have Bahasa Indonesia, Malaysia, Japanese, and Korean. And it also houses university-instituted language courses such as Mandarin, Thai, and Persian. The department regularly provides training through the summer seminars in linguistics and extramural classes in Asian languages. Now, it is my honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker for the Philippine Korean Studies Symposium. Dr. Hye-Kyung Lee is Reader in Cultural Policy at the Department of Culture, Media, and Creative Industries, King's College, London, UK. She is interested in dynamic relations between the cultural sector, the state, and the market, and has worked on cultural policy, art subsidy, cultural industries, and cultural fandom and marketing. Her publications include Cultural Policies in East Asia, Asian Cultural Flow, Cultural Policy in South Korea, Making a New Patron State, and Routledge Handbook of Cultural and Creative Industries in Asia. She co-edits Cultural Trends. Today, Dr. Lee will give us a presentation entitled Developing Cultural Policy in South Korea, Acceleration and Reflection. Let us welcome Dr. Hye-Kyung Lee. Dr. Lee, whenever you're ready.
Can I start my talk?
Yes, please start your presentation, Dr. Lee.
Yes. And thank you so much for having me. Let me begin my talk with saying that South Korea is known for not only the Korean wave, but also its active cultural policy. So when I say that I study cultural policy in South Korea, many people tend to ask this particular question, which is, how much has the South Korean government's cultural policy contributed to the Korean wave success? However, I should confess that this is not easy to scientifically examine the causal relations between cultural policy efforts on the one hand and the rise of the Korean wave on the other hand. It is because cultural policy produces both intended and unintended consequences, or it may produce no meaningful consequences at all. And sometimes there are gaps between policy intentions and outcomes. And another reason is that for developing the cultural sector and the cultural industries in particular, the roles of artists, cultural producers, cultural organizations, businesses, and market forces are very, very important. So it would be wrong to say that the Korean wave itself was created by the Korean government or its cultural policy. Would you show the next slide? Yeah, okay, thank you. However, I want to say that we can broadly note that cultural policy produce helpful environment for cultural industry development in South Korea through the deregulation in the 1990s, the provision of various supports and investments since 2000s, and financing important events such as international film and animation festivals, and also by introducing some key institutions or rules of the game in these industries. A good example is that the Korean government has created and introduced standard templates for contracts to be used by people and organizations in the cultural industries. So there are standard templates for contracts for film investment, TV production, TV script writing, publishing, etc., etc. Very often, we tend to believe that contracts naturally emerge from market-based relations, but the Korean case clearly demonstrates that these were introduced, some of these contracts were introduced or enhanced by the government who aims to protect workers and fairly allocate copyright across people who are involved in cultural production. And this consolidates the contractual relations within the industries and further institutionalize cultural industries as industries. So my suggestion is that we consider the nexus between cultural policy and the Korean wave from such a broad and institutional perspective. At the same time, it is equally interesting and kind of intriguing to explore the Korean society's shifting understanding of culture and the culture-state relationship and the culture economy dynamics by investigating cultural policy. Okay, next slide, please. For example, by observing cultural policy and its changes over time, we can learn about the evolving perception of culture in the Korean society. There are many ways to do this job, but here I'm suggesting that we have a look at how culture is understood and described in key cultural laws. The first one is one of the oldest culture-related laws in Korea. It was enacted in 1952. In this law, culture refers to research, scientific research, and the arts. And based on this law, the government created an Academy of Scientific Research and Academy of Arts. So there is some gap between the title of this law and the actual content of it. And it was not until 1972 when a law on state cultural subsidy was introduced. The authoritarian Park Chung-hee government introduced this law, which has underpinned the country's cultural and arts policy over the next 50 years. So you can see how important this law was and still is. And its initial version, culture and the arts included literature, art, music, entertainment, mainly commercial shows and recorded music, publishing, etc. Plus, there is heavy concern around Korean studies or researching, preserving traditional Korean culture and heritage. And another important instrument of cultural policy in the 1970s was the 5-year plan for the renaissance of culture and the arts. This plan covered traditional culture and literature, visual art, music, etc. And there was heavy emphasis on traditional culture. And actually, through this plan, the government provided a lot of subsidy to Korean studies, such as translation of Korean classics into ordinary Korean language, printing old manuscripts, researching folklore, and researching and practicing traditional music and preserving cultural heritage, tangible, intangible. And then this law was revised many times, and its 1990 version covered literature, art, music, dance, theater, entertainment, publishing, plus traditional culture, plus welfare of artists and cultural practitioners. And its 2005 version encompassed literature, art, music, entertainment, traditional music, and photography, architecture, plus cultural industries and cultural facilities. Although there were separate laws on cultural industries promotion at that time, this law still stipulated very strongly that the state and local authorities should implement policy measures to promote the cultural industries. And also this law underpinned the creation of the Independent Arts Council Korea as an art funding agency separated from the government. In 2014, the Framework Act on Culture was enacted to provide a basic framework for cultural policy in general and to function as a basis of other culture-related laws. And what is interesting about this law is it's very broad anthropological understanding of culture. It defines culture as a totality of mental, material, intellectual, and emotional characteristics of members of society, including arts, way of living, way of life, way of collective life, value system, tradition, and belief. And it asserts that Korean citizens have right to culture, right to enjoy culture and participate in cultural activities, and they shouldn't be discriminated in their cultural life because of their sex, religion, race, generation, residence, social and economic status, or physical conditions. So you can see that this law is very, very important in terms of redefining the meaning of culture in Korea and demonstrates the kind of future directions of cultural policy in this country. However, there is some gaps, such an ideal policy goal and the actual application of this law. And currently, this law specifies key areas of cultural policy, and they are mainly about traditional responsibilities of the cultural ministry, such as cultural heritage, arts, cultural industries, cultural welfare, leisure, international cultural exchange, etc. So we are yet to learn about whether or how this law, its anthropological definition of culture, can make real changes to the country's existing cultural policy. And finally, the latest version of CAPA covers literature, art, music, dance, theater, entertainment, traditional music, etc., and comics, and cultural industries, cultural facilities, and supporting cultural activities for the disabled, cultural welfare for marginalized communities, and cultural vouchers. So, over time, the emphasis on traditional culture and heritage has weakened, and it has almost disappeared. The meaning of culture has broadened. However, there are also gaps between policy intentions and rhetoric and the reality. For example, although the Framework Act on Culture adopts a very broad meaning of culture, the Korean cultural policy is still pretty much producer-centered and focused on professionally made arts and commercial cultural businesses. So, amateur arts, everyday creativity, co-creation, community-based creative activities by ordinary citizens these activities take quite marginal positions still. Okay, next slide, please. Examining cultural policy allows us better comprehend the shifting relationship between culture and state. An interesting way to do this is to look at various photos in the official publications. I'm fascinated by the presence of the Korean national flag in those images, as you can see here. And over time, I find that over time, this flag has become smaller and smaller and become marginalized, and then eventually it disappeared completely. So first, let's have a look at the first image. Do you think that this is a gathering of artists and creative practitioners? Actually, it is. It was the photo was taken in '74. Here, the national flag dominated the scene, and the event looks very formal and bureaucratic. And we can easily sense that the Park Chung-hee government at that time had tight control over every aspect of the cultural life in the country. And there was co-option and cooperation between the authoritarian government and key cultural associations and very well-known artists at that time. In this period, arts and culture were discussed within the framework of nationalistic and patriotic agenda. And the second photo was taken 1985. The size of national flag became smaller, but everything else looks quite similar. Maybe we have more female artists or female representatives of the sector here. Then the country went through the successful democratization, and this redefined the culture-state relationship fundamentally. And this new relationship is actually demonstrated in the next photo taken in the middle of 2000s. Here, the Arts Council Korea is announcing its vision for the country's arts policy. No national flag, no nationalistic or statist agenda, no political control, and artistic freedom is taken for granted and celebrated. However, we should note that there is continuing impact or presence of historical legacy. First, many important institutions of cultural policy were introduced, created, and systemized under the authoritarian Park Chung-hee government. For example, state art subsidy, state film subsidy, heritage protection policy, various national arts festivals, and many folklore festivals were created and institutionalized by Park's government. And these policies were tightly connected to the government's, at that time, the government's control and propaganda, and they constituted the cultural dimensions of authoritarian regime at that time. At the same time, however, we cannot deny that the institutionalized state cultural support and protection provided resources to the cultural sector and supported artists and cultural organizations. So the reality of cultural policy at that time was quite complicated. And another aspect of this complexity is that despite the successful democratization and liberalization, there is this continuation of top-down state-driven cultural policy. So still we have the state-driven cultural policy in Korea. And so since the 60s and the 70s, in Korea, we have never had a small government in cultural policy. Although there were talks about making government small, making the state small, cultural policy in Korea has continuously expanded. The cultural budget has increased, and the public cultural infrastructure has been strengthened over time. The next slide shows the cultural government spending on culture. So we believe that how much the government is financially committed to culture is important. However, as the slide shows, we cannot say that the Korean government is a big spender, heavy spender on culture in comparison with other countries. And this is OECD, general government spending, and it shows Korean government spends around 1% of GDP on culture, including recreation and religion. So it isn't at the top of the league, and the Korean government is kind of behind the governments in most European countries in terms of spending on culture. However, what is more important is that in Korea, government has a very particular attitude towards cultural policy. That is, its strong belief in state responsibility for cultural investment and art funding, and its willingness to make policies and its capacity to make policies and implement them. In this sense, the Korean cultural policy is distinguished from the so-called neoliberal cultural policies in Anglophone countries such as the UK or Australia, or the minimalist cultural policy in Japan. Korea is, when it comes to cultural policy, Korea is in parallel with France and Germany, who take culture very seriously, and Korea takes culture very, very seriously. However, in comparison with these two traditional cultural patron states, Korea is more pragmatic, more practical, showing a lot of interest in strengthening the economic power of culture, the cultural industries in particular. And next slide, please. Broadly speaking, the Korean cultural policy since the late 1990s has shown a parallel development. So democratic arts policy in the one hand, and very active and sort of state-driven cultural industry policy on the other hand. So in the Korean cultural policy context, democracy has been interpreted in three different distinct ways. First, artistic freedom and creative freedom became a norm, and the idea of state support without interference, without intervention, has been widely accepted, and this idea has been very, very popular. It has been a kind of norm now. And such an idea has been institutionalized through the creation of the Arts Council in 2005. The second, the Arts Council tried to pursue not only passive autonomy, that is autonomy from the state, but also active autonomy, that is autonomy to actively make arts policy based on artists' own participation in cultural policy making, arts policy making. The third is that democracy was understood as an increased public accessibility to culture and their enjoyment of culture and arts activities and opportunities. Now, one of the most important goals of cultural policy, especially arts policy, was to make culture accessible as widely as possible, and particularly for marginalized people and communities. So Arts Council began expanding programs that bring arts to these communities. And this role has increased over time. And currently, this is interesting to know, the Arts Council's budget for cultural accessibility and enjoyment is much bigger than its budget for artistic creation. So you can see some tensions is arising here. The flagship program in cultural enjoyment is called Culture Voucher Program, which is about giving vouchers to lesser people so that they can use the vouchers on arts, cinema, books, travel, such as transport and accommodation, etc., etc. And less than 2% is spent on the arts, such as performing arts or exhibition. So this program is more about leisure policy or tourism or entertainment policy. And overall, there is some tensions arising. The Arts Council's previous focus on artistic creation and artist-centered policymaking isn't really easy to be reconciled with the goal of democratizing culture and making culture more and more accessible to ordinary people in the country. And another point is that although the Arts Council today spends a lot of money on cultural enjoyment, it is more about cultural consumption, leisure consumption, rather than citizens' own creation of culture and everyday cultural practices. So policymakers and researchers have noticed these tensions, but I don't think that there are notable debates or discussion on these issues. And another interesting development is artists' welfare, and this has emerged as a new, very important subset of cultural policy in this country. The critical moment was at 2012 when the Artists Welfare Foundation was created under the Cultural Ministry, under the support by this ministry. This foundation takes a broad definition of artists, including not only professional artists, but also people who are working in the commercial cultural industries. And the foundation provides artists and cultural practitioners with bursaries, and it subsidizes their monthly contribution to industrial accident insurance, national pension, and the newly introduced artist unemployment insurance. And the foundation also artificially create jobs for artists. So this is a huge development, very, very important area of cultural policy in Korea. And this isn't something that was imaginable 20 years ago, if we like. Next slide, please. Through examining cultural policy, we can also learn about the evolving dynamics between culture and economy. Interestingly, until recently, this relationship was mediated by the discourse of crisis, either national crisis or national economic crisis. Under Park Chung-hee government in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, first, national culture itself was seen as being in crisis due to the rapid modernization and the influx of Western culture, Western values and norms. And secondly, the government at that time believed that the Korean economy wouldn't progress unless there was an adequate cultural change in the mind of Korean people. The idea was that culture was a sphere in which people develop positive attitude to life, to society, and where people develop desirable work ethics and mental skills required for the speedy industrialization in the 60s and 70s. So in this sense, culture was perceived as the second economy, 제2의 경제, the second economy, and as a dispensable part of economic development of the country. So to sum up, it was believed that national culture itself was in crisis, but national culture was a facilitator for the country's economic progress. And the culture was a solution to the problems generated by industrialization and urbanization. The nexus between culture and economy was mediated again by the discourse of national crisis in the context of the 1997 financial crisis. This time, culture was reimagined as the country's new economic force and a driver that would transform the Korean economy to a knowledge-centered post-industrial economy. So culture was re-articulated as a solution to the nation's economic problem and a new industrial area in which Korea should catch up with the advanced powers such as the US and Japan. So during the past 20 years, cultural industry policy in Korea has accelerated. So now I'll point out three core aspects of it. So the first slide shows the discursive roles played by the government. The idea of cultural industries was first advanced by Kim Il-sung government in the middle of 1990s, and then legally defined by Kim Dae-jung government. According to this very, very important law, the Framework Act on the promotion of cultural industries. Cultural industries refer to the industries related to the production, distribution, and consumption of cultural commodities. Here, cultural commodities means goods, services, and their combination that create economic added values by embodying cultural elements. So you can see that the whole idea of cultural industry is centered around economic values of culture. And in 2003, this law introduced a new idea, which is cultural content. So here, content means data or information of symbol, text, voice, audio, and screen image. And cultural content means content embodying cultural elements. So discursively, culture became content, and Korean people became more and more comfortable with the idea of commodifying and commercializing culture for economic gains. So culture is no longer something to protect, but it's something that can be strategically created and grown for their economic impacts. Similarly, globalization is no longer a threat. Rather, it is now understood as a medium, very useful medium for Korean cultures reaching out to global audiences. And second, the state support for cultural industries. As I'm based in the UK, I often compare the UK government's approach to cultural industries with the Korean government approaches. And there is a big difference, sort of fundamental difference between these two. In the UK, the government prefers generic approaches such as creative education, creative cluster. But in Korea, the Cultural Ministry and its agency, KOCA, has taken industry-specific approaches. So the policy isn't simply horizontal, but it is very much vertical. In other words, in addition to generic policies on cultural infrastructure, technology, and intellectual property rights, copyrights, policymakers have developed very sophisticated policy measures to push individual industries to increase their capacity and export potential. The games industry policy is an example. As you can see here, the policy touches on every aspect of the games business, from ideation, production, to marketing and export. Okay. The third characteristic is the Korean government's strategic use of finance, such as venture capital investment and loan guarantees to support cultural production. I find the use of venture capital or VC particularly interesting because it has reshaped, kind of reorganized how cultural financing is organized in the country by creating a cultural venture capital market. So it's really interesting to see that this particular financial market has been created and expanded by state intervention. So on behalf of the Cultural Ministry and Film Council, a mega fund under the country's SME ministry puts money into VC funds, so these funds can invest in cultural and film productions or companies. So the Korean government is the biggest investor in this cultural venture capital market, and in many projects and companies are financed through this market. Of course, you can imagine tensions are arising because this market deals with different motivations and interests. For example, between profitability and public interest, and also between government goals and private investors' motivations, and VC companies' pursuit for financial gains, capital gains. So balancing out these different interests is very tricky, very complicated job that is done by the Cultural Ministry and Film Council at the moment. Okay, the next slide, please. So far, I have quickly summarized the rapid development or acceleration of the Korean cultural policy. However, recent years have seen some fundamental challenges to the policy, and policymakers are under increasing pressure to reflect on and reconsider the core premises of cultural policy in the country. The first crisis was caused by the blacklist scandal. To make this long story short, this is about the latest conservative President Park Geun-hye imposing a blacklist on the Arts Council and some national cultural organizations so that the affected artists should be excluded from state funding or their performances be cancelled. To our dismay, disappointment, and frustration, both the Cultural Ministry and the Arts Council were involved in this scandal incident, following the orders from the presidential office. And this was a really extraordinary and anachronic incident. And I think that it is easy to criticize Park Geun-hye and Park Geun-hye's regime and Park Geun-hye's wrongdoings. But what is more difficult to do is to reflect on this and comprehend and understand why the Arts Council, run by professional artists, cultural experts, and professional cultural administrators, failed to resist the political pressure from the top. And obviously, Arts Council was set up as an independent arts funding agency, but it failed to be independent and autonomous. And of course, there were complaints and protests from the arts communities. However, the restoration of the Arts Council's autonomy was achieved by the government change rather than its own calling for artistic autonomy or sectoral autonomy. And I wonder what it means for the culture-state relationship in South Korea. So this is a really big question to contemplate. The second challenge comes from the pandemic, as everyone knows. And so during this pandemic, the cultural sector is under the huge pressure, and the government tried to act quickly, and actually it responded quickly, but its rescue packages are not enough to alleviate the hardship faced by the sector. And although the country has Artists Welfare Foundation, its activity, what it is doing now hardly satisfies the increasing demand for public support. And Arts Council's funding, again, doesn't really compensate for the damages caused by the pandemic. As for cultural industries, some sectors, they are okay. For example, the games industry and TV production industry. However, film production, cinema business, and commercial musical production have been very hardly hit. They are having a very, very difficult time at this moment. So while suffering financially, these industries and sectors are also pressurized to modify their business models to survive the long-lasting pandemic and the post-pandemic world, if you like. The COVID crisis, I believe, created a very critical moment to reflect on the core basis of cultural policy. For example, we may want to ask this kind of fundamental question: why culture is valuable? So far, state cultural support was somewhat taken for granted. People didn't ask questions why state supports culture. It has been so much taken for granted. And people also widely accepted the economic values of culture. Now, the cultural sector demands more funding, artists demand more support, and the support isn't enough. And at the same time, the economic discourse of culture is losing its appeal because the pandemic demonstrates that actually many of the cultural industries are quite vulnerable to external shocks such as COVID pandemic. So a fresh set of questions are arising at the moment. Again, why culture is important, why it is valuable for us, why it deserves public support. And in what sense, the profession of artists and cultural practitioners are essential for society, therefore deserve extra support from the government and from public sources of money. And so far, Korean cultural policy and also cultural policy in other countries have prioritized liveness, the realness over the virtual. However, the pandemic poses a fundamental question to this, and policymakers are under pressure to identify the areas for new policy intervention to facilitate the digital transformation of art organizations and the cultural sector broadly. And as mentioned earlier, the blacklist scandal seriously damaged the confidence of cultural policy in Korea. And regaining the confidence wouldn't be an easy job, easy process. And the Arts Council is still suffering from this. And I believe that this also needs a lot of reflection and contemplation. So this is a continuing challenge for the cultural sector and the cultural ministry and Arts Council. And finally, the rapidly changing environment seems to require quick responses from the cultural policy, cultural ministry. And the government and its agencies are quite excellent at quickly making policies, quickly responding. But I believe that now is a really critical moment, and so Korean cultural policymakers, they really need to carefully reflect on the existing basis of cultural policy and its old and new challenges before continuing to make policies and accelerate policy development. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. Casey, I think that you are on mute.
Oh.
Yes.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for that very insightful presentation. I was saying I also am a fan of Korean cultural content, specifically Korean drama. So it's really interesting for me to learn more about the Korean cultural policy. It's also interesting to know how Korean society's definition and understanding of the concept culture itself has transformed and broadened over time. And I think it's also important to note that the present Korean cultural policy has been greatly influenced by the policy institutionalized during the authoritarian regime, and how even during that time, great importance was placed on culture as a driver of modernization and industrialization. So thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for sharing with us a very insightful and comprehensive presentation. I think we have some questions here from the audience. Dr. Lee, let me just read some of them. I think we have one from Dr. Baekyoung Min. So this is for, Dr. Lee. As the current Korean government is highlighting the impact of soft power, various creative strategies are witnessed. What do you think the current administration shows uniqueness in implementing the national cultural policy? How do you think the current administration shows uniqueness in the implementation of the national cultural policy?
And I think that, yes, broadly speaking, I think that since the Kim Dae-jung government in the late 1990s, there is this continuation of cultural policy, and this kind of, I explained that in with saying that there has been a parallel development of kind of democratic autonomous arts policy. However, it has been kind of seriously damaged by blacklist scandal. This is one. Another part is promoting cultural industries and increasing cultural power of Korea by exporting more and more culture and cultural products to other countries. So this emphasis has been continuing, and the current government, the Moon Jae-in government, is also keen on increasing the nation's soft power. But one difference I've noticed that it's kind of emphasis on how do I say, kind of rhetorically, perhaps it's emphasis on humanistic characteristics, feature of cultural policy. So it's a cultural policy caring for people. So it uses a lot this word people. So this is part. It's from the slogan of the Moon Jae-in government, and it's puts kind of more emphasis on helping out small cultural producers and rebalancing between power of big corporations, cultural corporations, and small producers through policy making. So we can see some changes in terms of slogan, rhetoric, and in terms of real intention to a certain degree. But overall, I think that's the policy sort of orientation. We have the same, this we have seen this continuation of policy orientation, the same policy orientation since the 1990s, late 1990s. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. You also mentioned earlier the Arts Welfare Foundation, which was established in 2012. So does this mean there are more support given to the Korean artists producing cultural contents now in the Moon Jae-in administration?
Yeah, but it's interesting that it was enacted, the law was passed, related law was passed, and the foundation was created under the conservative government. So you can see that there is no kind of clear-cut party politics, in my view, in cultural politics in Korea. And what Park Geun-hye was doing, there was kind of anachronic. It's kind of so unacceptable and very unusual, extraordinary, and silly, frustrating attempt to control culture.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Lee. I have another question here for you from Sawol Sonsengnim. The question is, do Korean government has their priority sector or industry in giving their financial support for the cultural policy?
I believe that the government has to try to identify cultural sectors and promising ones, or the ones industries that need support to develop. So it's kind of, if you look at government documents and policy measures, there is this mixture, quite intriguing mixture, because government want to support the industry that is doing well, games industry, the musical industry. They themselves are already industries. They are highly commercial. They attract investment, etc. There is huge fan bases, but still government wants to support because they are doing well. There is a lot of potential for export, for example. At the same time, we want to support smaller industry, emerging industries, because they need support. So I think the overall games industries and animations and comics attracted a lot of attention. And nowadays, commercial musical shows and fashion industry, government began showing interest in fashion industry. But I do not think that it invests a lot because the industry itself is commercially oriented, operating. So yeah, I think the games and animation, comics, and film industry, of course.
Another question from Sir Jem Javier. Thank you. I think there's a comment here. Okay. Thank you for the insightful presentation, Dr. Hye-Kyung Lee. I was wondering if there have been efforts to forward minority cultural communities in the national cultural policy of the country. Oh, this is an interesting question from Sir Jem Javier. So are there efforts to forward minority cultural communities in the national cultural policy of South Korea?
Yes, it's part of arts policy, not part of cultural industries policy. There is kind of clear
Yeah.
demarcation between
Okay.
art and commercial culture. And it depends on how you define minority communities. If you
Yes.
see it as economically or socially less of people, and as I mentioned, there is this growing subset of arts policy and cultural policy, which is about increasing their access to arts activities and cultural opportunities. But if you define minorities in terms of ethnicity, there is an increasing number of ethnically diverse communities and families in Korea. And there is kind of increased policy, how do I say, measures targeted at these ethnically diverse groups of people. It is in between cultural policy and population policy or social policy. So it is, but again, it's mainly about how to more easily or how to help the ethnic minority populations in Korea to be successfully assimilated to Korean culture. So there are support, a lot of programs, but there are some limitations as well.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Lee. We have here another question from Ms. Kat. I will just read what she wrote here in the comment section. 안녕하세요, 이 선생님. Thank you so much for the comprehensive discussions. My question is, why culture did not produce economic growth way back in the history of South Korea? That's her question.
Very interesting question. I need research. I'm interested in looking at the 70s very much. But some people say that, I think that film scholars, people who look at film industry says that actually at that time, Korean film industry earned some money from export Korean films to many Asian countries. And the Hong Kong filmmakers came to Korea to shoot their films there. So some money generated. So it isn't simply, it isn't the fact that the culture didn't earn any money at that time, but it was a small amount of money. And cultural sector, in 60s, until 60s, Korea was one of the world poorest countries, and then people didn't really care about culture. And yes, although there were wonderful artists and cultural creators at that time, pretty much they relied on the state support. And without state support, cultural institutions, they couldn't survive. And then it was the state, and that began funding creation of cultural infrastructure. So, but I think that the question is really interesting. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I think we have another question here from Sem Pabion. Let me read his message. 선생님, 안녕하세요. What can the Philippines learn from the development in cultural policy in South Korea? And how can these developments contribute to the economic and societal growth of the Philippines?
Yeah, this is another very, very interesting question.
Yeah. What do you think are the
what to
positive points of cultural policies in Korea?
Yes, at the same time, maybe I think that's one very one strength of South Korean cultural policy today is continuation. It's kind of stability and consistency.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that although there have been party politics, but broadly there is little party politics in Korea in comparison with what is happening in other countries. So either, regardless of government, supporting culture has been the state responsibility. So it has been a state project rather than a government project. So it wasn't conservative government project or progressive government project. it has been the state project regardless of party politics. So I think this is really important. And another thing is that the cultural sectors, particularly art sectors, endeavor to become more autonomous, more independent, or to create autonomous structure of arts policy, although there have been some failures, some really big challenges, but this endeavor and discussion is quite important. And in relation to cultural industries development, again, state, I think that this Korean case is particularly Korean. So it's uniquely Korean. So it's kind of what we have now is a kind of historical combination of
Yes.
you know what, something from the
Yeah, you mentioned earlier some of the intended and unintended
yes,
results of the
exactly.
Korean cultural
Yes, so there
policies.
are some endeavors, efforts made from the government, but at the same
Yeah.
time, you know, the cultural industries, as cultural sectors, they were dynamic. They themselves were developing dynamically, and that was supported by the government removal of censorship, you know, government giving them freedom, and
Yeah.
then opening up space for them to kind of grow freely, and a lot of experiments, and yeah, this is one something we need to think about. The nice combination between the public sector activities, efforts, and private sector capacities and activities.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. We have here another question from Dr. Bubbles Beverly Asor. Yeah, she says, many thanks for the fascinating talk, Dr. Lee. The council members are appointed by the state. To what extent does this culture politics relations affect the autonomy of Arts Council?
Yeah, this is a question I keep asking. Yes, but this
Mm-hmm.
mechanism that council members are formally appointed by the state, this applies to Arts Council England, Arts Council Scotland. Now Scotland doesn't have an Arts Council; it has Creative Scotland, but Arts Council Wales, Arts Council in Norway, Arts Council in Sweden. So arts councils in many countries. So this appointment system doesn't really define, I think, the state culture relationship. Uh, but we can say that in the Korean context, maybe it influences within this the Korean context of this historically embedded relationship between state and the arts sector. So it's really tricky because Korea is a fully democratic, one of the most mature democracies in Asia. In terms of arts policy, people have freedom. People can criticize the government through their art. It is accepted and welcomed. Although there was this Park Geun-hye blacklist scandal, um, still, but in some ways, this autonomy of arts relies on state capacity. That's quite intriguing. So I was kind of sort of perplexed
Yeah.
or intrigued by seeing a proposal by arts communities, the proposal that was made as part of their solutions to blacklist scandal and the arts policy crisis. And the proposal included this idea of setting up the state art council uh, under the president, directly under the president. So I wondered, we are talking about autonomy, and then why do they want to create
Yeah.
state committee on the arts? Why do they want to rely on the power of the state again to restore and to gain more autonomy for the arts? So I think this is really interesting to look at and research.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. We have another question here from Diana Cassandra Almares. How did Korea break from a traditional nationalistic cultural policy? What can the Philippines learn from Korea's cultural policy in order to appeal also to the foreign audience?
I think whether it was intended by the government or unintended, it happened naturally. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's I kind of promoted my book. Please read.
Okay. Oh, I want to read
Yes,
that, Dr. Lee.
chapter 4. Again,
Okay.
I was fascinated by this disappearance of national in Korean cultural policy discussion that happened around middle of 90s. Rhetorically, this act, what is CAPA, Culture and
CPA.
Arts Promotion Act, still it has this rhetoric of national culture. Really surprising to me, still 2021, at the beginning, just one sentence, and then nothing about national culture. And this happened in the 1990s. Yes, and there was this struggle between the government and kind of cultural activists at that time about who owned the interpretation of national culture. So government
Yeah.
has its interpretation, is a history, patriotic, traditional, etc. And the cultural activists at that time kind of reinterpreted the national from the people's folklore and collective aesthetics that could be found in the traditional folklore art in Korea, etc. And then so there was different understanding of national, and then kind of there was a struggle between two interpretations, and then I think that that was interesting. So that's the cultural activists at the time, 90s, they didn't succeed. But government also couldn't protect its traditional understanding of the national or the national culture, traditional culture, on the face of the rising commercialism, commercial culture at that time. But this kind of dynamics between two different understandings of tradition and nation and the rising commercialism, the commercial culture and fandom and K-pop. It wasn't called K-pop, but the very lively,
Yeah.
popular music industry at the time. So all these were kind of entangled, and then eventually the people began no longer concerned about traditional culture, national culture. By the time Kim Dae-jung Kim Dae-jung came to the power.
Yeah. And I think she has another question here, Dr. Lee. What can the Philippines learn? Oh, I think you already answered this, but her one difference here from the questions earlier is that what can the Philippines learn from Korea's cultural policy in order to appeal to the foreign
Mm,
audience? In your opinion,
yes,
Dr.
yes.
Lee, what can you say?
Um, we're kind of combining both. It's Korean cultural products. They are both. They are
Yes.
quite Korean, uniquely Korean still. Although they talk to international audiences. At the same time, is Korea has kind of reinvented the meaning of globalization from its own perspective. So the kind of be open to foreign influences and pop music from Japan, America, and popular culture from the UK, etc. So in a way, that being itself and being Korean, and at the same time being open to other people's the ways of life and their cultural expressions, and kind of nicely combine them could be one way. Yes,
Yes.
yeah. But yeah, I think that this is kind of interesting and positive development. Korean cultural products have been kind of become more international, more culturally diverse and hybrid. That's something Philippine cultural producers and cultural industries can think about.
Do you also, just a follow-up question, Dr. Lee, do you also think that Korea um, enjoys more freedom now in terms of the content, of the theme, of the cultural products they're developing? Now that, of course, Korea is enjoying great popularity in Asia and, of course, around the world as well.
Yes, yeah, that's
You're
important.
not limiting now to just promoting Korean culture, but you're very much, experimenting now with the content and the themes of your contents, cultural contents. Yeah. So we have here another question from River Rosal. Can you comment personally why the Arts Council was not able to restore their own autonomy that it took the government's effort instead? I ask for purposes of modeling South Korea's cultural policy. Thanks. That's all there's in
So, yeah, why Arts Council wasn't
It's related to,
able, yeah.
to restore their own autonomy.
Yeah. I kind of, the second part of the question, purposes of modeling. What do you mean by modeling South Korean cultural policy? The first question, well, I ask this question continuously to myself, and
Yes.
yes, yeah, and there is this kind of, I don't know, kind of habit, or again, historically informed, historically shaped sort of mentality of the art sector, or its kind of habitual reliance on the state capacity, although art sector now has its own capacity to be more professional and to be more independent. Actually, it is independent in every aspect. But when it comes to funding, support, the public support, and talking about arts policy, still I see this kind of sort of unconscious or habitual reliance on state provision, state support. Yeah. And regarding modeling,
Thank you.
yeah,
With the modeling.
I couldn't quite understood the question, the second part of the question.
Yeah, maybe we can ask Miss River Rosal to probably comment again here to elaborate on the question. Thank you, Dr. Lee. We have another question here from Miss Farah Konanan. Do interracial marriages and foreign migration to Korea impact South Korea's cultural policy?
Yeah, very interesting question, very important question. But overall, no, because although it is becoming part of cultural policy, part of art policy, if you like. However, this policy is currently located between cultural policy and population policy and education policy. So this area is growing, but cultural policy is only partially involved. So basically, the main ministry who is looking after this is the Ministry of Gender and Families. It's a formal title, Gender Equality and Youth and Families. So they approach this issue from mainly from the family perspective. They focus on culturally diverse, multi-ethnic families in Korea, and kind of government tries to incorporate them nicely into the mainstream Korean society, mainstream culture in terms of language and other things. So, so education ministry is involved very deeply, and this Ministry of Gender Equality and Family is leading the development. And my understanding is the Culture Ministry knows about how this policy is developing and provides support, but its role is secondary in comparison with the programs and schemes operated by the other two ministries, education and gender equality and family.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lee. And we have one last question here from Louis Vincent Amante. He says, good day, Dr. Hye-Kyung Lee. Most Filipinos know about Korea through K-dramas and K-pop, original and dubbed. How does translation from Hangul to other languages fit in South Korea's cultural policy?
Yeah, translation. There has been a huge a change in the past.
Oh,
Yeah. In the past, I was working for the Korea Foundation. You know what Korea Foundation is
yes,
doing.
yes.
The big part of not my job, but of the job of Korea Foundation was translating South Korean books and cultural materials so that Korean culture could be disseminated widely to foreign audiences.
Yes.
So the government policymakers was very conscious about that. That was policymakers' job. There was an area where money should go. And however, over time, as Korean cultural products has it's been gaining more and more popularity, nowadays, when it comes to popular culture, Netflix, they
Yeah.
invest in
Yeah.
right, nicely, and there are fans from all over the world. They try to learn Korean. They try to contribute to, they try to be cultural ambassadors for Korea. So they translate. In doing so, they learn Korean language. They make friends. They enjoy the process.
Yes.
There is a kind of army, army of voluntary fan translators. So they are sort of co-creating Korean culture. They are adding more values to Korean culture. Very, very important part of the Korean wave. But I think that on part of the government, still there is funding for translation, audio materials. And maybe I think that maybe government policymakers wants to translate unknown works, which are not serious novels, serious writings and independent
Yes.
cultural products, etc. Yeah, translation is so important.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Maybe we can ask just two last questions. Oh, our audience are very actively participating today, which is very good. They're very interested in your talk, Dr. Lee. We have a question here from Rainy Evangelista. She says, "Good day, Professor Lee. How does South Korea cultural diplomacy relate with the crafting and developing of the country's cultural policy?"
Um, so the question is about the relationship, cultural diplomacy and cultural
Yeah,
policy.
diplomacy and cultural
Not about,
policy. Yes.
okay, yes. They are kind of sort of related, very closely connected. Um, and the Korean government knows that culture can be now very powerfully useful for
Yes.
diplomacy. Yes, yeah. So government kind of when the president tours foreign countries, the president tend to bring popular, I don't know, but kind of
Yeah.
tend to be associated with pop culture. And the
Ambassadors. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
ambassador, the meeting idols and kind of try to be associated with popular culture. That is a kind of a
Yes.
soft strategy for the Korean government. And yes, I think that you can find many examples of these connections between Korea's cultural diplomacy and cultural policy. And then we have two different ministries. I don't know how they work together. Maybe some competition and some collaboration. Yes,
Yes.
yes. And Korea Foundation is still under the foreign ministry. It's part of diplomacy.
Mm.
Before it wasn't interest in popular culture. No way. It was all about traditional culture, folklore, and
Yeah.
very serious part of Korean arts. But now it publishes annually a thick book which surveys the global fandom, 지구촌 한류 map, something like
Wow. Wow.
that.
Annually, Dr. Lee.
Yeah,
Oh.
even the responsibility of Korea Foundation has changed a lot. It talks
Yes.
a
Yes.
lot about popular culture today. Yeah, that's interesting.
So they also produce contents in different languages, I can imagine, not just in Korean, but English and other. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Lee, we have two more questions. I mentioned, okay, we have one last question which was sent to us. Okay, we have one here from Charlie Roy Cabanos. Yeah. I would like to ask regarding the culture policy despite of its success. On the other side, the backlash from the critics describing it as a cultural invasion. And what is your opinion on how Korea can deal with it can deal with this issue from the critics, from the backlash or the negative comments and the negative.
Yeah, you need a backlash from other countries. The perception of Korean wave as a sort of cultural imperialist invasion.
Yeah,
And I
right.
think yes, and the best way to deal with this is that kind of government kind of step back from its attempt to ride the wave. So the government wants to associate itself with the Korean wave success, but it can be stepped back because, as I mentioned, there are many different factors have been operating behind this success, and big part comes from overseas consumers and fans, their own interpretation of Korean cultural texts, and also their contribution as cultural ambassadors and active cultural appreciator, if you like, and their translation, etc. So I think that maybe Korean government, because without government intentional sort of connection to the Korean wave, the government can support the industry behind the scene and addressing more fundamental sort of institutional issues of the industry, so that the industry can grow nicely. And then one of the positive outcomes will be Korean wave success. And then just keep it going rather than, just trying to, attach everything, every success of Korean wave back to what the government is doing and to promote its policy. And yeah, and from the side of policymakers, I think that it should be interesting if the culture ministry will make intentional efforts to kind of diversify cultural repertoire consumed in Korea. I think that many Korean people may want to watch, dramas from other parts of Asia or arts from other countries, particularly from Asia. If government makes some efforts to facilitate Asia-Korea collaboration and cultural encounters, that should be really interesting. It will be a good way to tackle that backlash. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And just one last question from Mr. Jericho Luke Behoko. As it is known that Korean literature made its role to the country in the longest run until now, how do Korean people approach other varied literatures, including English literature? Maybe you can just share with us your own opinion.
Because I haven't done any research on that, so what I can say is my own personal opinions.
Yes, please.
And Korean, literature has a long history, and it has very solid basis of artists and the publishers and writers, etc. But it is very open to foreign literature, English language literature in particular. And so Korean people tend to find a kind of mixture of Korean literature and foreign literature in the market. And years ago, there was kind of alarm bell ringing about the invasion of Japanese literature. The panic sort of in the media. So there is a huge readers of Japanese literature, novels in particular in South Korea. But still, I think that's not bad. So Korean people learn about Japanese culture through reading the Japanese novels. And I hope that, and nowadays, I think that the literature sector or the government in particular is more confident about the power or potential of Korean literature because of some of the success of these novels abroad. So it kind of relies on overseas endorsement and overseas success. Um,
Yeah.
but anyway, that's made the government more comfortable and confident, and it's getting more excited about supporting translation of serious literature. It's Korean literature. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, and thank you very much, everyone, for your active participation in today's session. That concludes our open forum. Dr. Lee, do you have any additional last comments you would want to share our audience today? Maybe you can promote your book too.
Yes, yeah, I was
To those who
promoting.
want to learn more about,
Yeah,
cultural
yeah.
policy in South Korea.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think,
Yes,
yeah.
the book, and also, if you have questions, I enjoyed the questions, and I thought that I share the questions. I asked some of these
Yeah.
questions myself still. So if you have any further comments or questions, feel free to email me. You can Google me
Oh.
at KCL Hye-Kyung Lee, and then you can find my email address. And yeah, I hope to have a continuous conversation with people who attended this event. And I enjoyed the event. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. We learned a lot from you in today's lecture. Once again, we truly appreciate Dr. Hye-Kyung Lee. We wish that this partnership will continue to engage in other fruitful initiatives in the future. And thank you, everyone who joined today from the Philippines, Korea, and other places. We hope to see you in our upcoming events of UPKRC and the Department of Linguistics in the coming months. Please keep posted through our Facebook page and YouTube channel. So here are the upcoming events of UPKRC and Linguistics Department. So we're going to have for the month of August 2 events. The first one would be UPKRC and Foreign Service Institute's Mabini Dialogue Series. That will be on August 6, 2021 from 2 to 4 p.m. And we're going to be organizing, the UP Department of Linguistics is organizing the 14th Philippine Linguistics Congress from August 24 to 26. So we hope you can all join those 2 events we prepared for you. For UPKRC, if you want to know more about the UP Korea Research Center and our events, please visit the Facebook page, facebook.com/UPKRC. And for UP Department of Linguistics, please visit facebook.com/UPLinguistics for more updates and for our events. With that, we formally conclude this session. Maraming salamat po. Kamsahamnida. Magandang araw sa inyong lahat.